The highway was dead silent except for the hum of my engine and the faint crackle of an old playlist streaming through my car speakers. New Year's Eve, and I was hours away from civilization, driving through a stretch of road that barely saw traffic during the day, let alone at midnight. My dog, Murphy, was curled up in the passenger seat, his tail occasionally thumping against the seat in his sleep. I spotted a rest area sign up ahead, just a faded wooden post and an arrow pointing into the darkness. I'd been driving for hours, and my eyelids felt heavy. 5 minutes to stretch my legs and let Murphy out seemed harmless. The rest area wasn't much. A cracked asphalt lot, a single bench, and a rusted sign warning travelers to stay aware of wildlife. I parked under the flickering glow of a lone street lamp and stepped out into the freezing night air, Murphy leaping out right after me. His nose immediately went to the ground, sniffing along the edges of the asphalt. But then he froze, his ears perked up, body stiff. A low growl rumbled from his chest as he stared toward the tree line at the edge of the lot. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, following his gaze. That's when I noticed it. Faint beams of light flickering between the trees, accompanied by muffled voices, distant but unmistakably human. I squinted into the dark forest, trying to make sense of the flickering lights. They didn't move like flashlights someone was casually holding. They bobbed and weaved erratically, as if whoever held them was moving fast. The muffled voices were sharp, hushed, almost frantic. Murphy's growl grew louder, his tail stiff and his body low to the ground. Then, without warning, he bolted. His leash slipped from my hand before I could react, and he vanished into the shadows of the tree line. "Murphy!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the empty parking lot. My pulse spiked as I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight and running after him. Branches snapped under my boots as I stumbled into the dense forest, the cold air clawing at my lungs. The trees were thick, the undergrowth tangled around my ankles as I pushed forward. The flashlight beam danced wildly across the ground and trunks, illuminating flashes of discarded items. A torn sleeping bag, an empty backpack, a single hiking boot half buried in leaves. My stomach turned as I realized the scene in front of me wasn't just abandoned. It was the aftermath of something violent. "Murphy!" I hissed again, my voice shaking. A soft whimper came from up ahead, and I followed the sound until I saw him. He was crouched low, tail tucked between his legs, staring into the darkness beyond the clearing. And then I felt it, a presence, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the edge of the clearing, and there, partially hidden behind a tree, were two eyes staring back at me. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand as I locked eyes with whoever, or whatever, was hiding behind the tree. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just stared back at me with a cold, unsettling stillness. Murphy let out a low whimper, his tail tucked so tightly that his body trembled. My throat felt dry, and every instinct in me screamed to run. "Murphy, come here," I whispered, crouching low and extending a hand. He hesitated for a second before inching toward me, his eyes still locked on the shadow in the trees. As soon as he was close enough, I grabbed his collar and began backing away slowly, keeping the flashlight pointed at the figure. But then, movement. A subtle shift in the dark, the faint sound of a branch snapping underfoot. I turned and ran. Branches scraped against my face and tangled in my hair as I barreled through the undergrowth, dragging Murphy with me. My flashlight beam jerked wildly, casting chaotic streaks of light through the trees. Behind me, I could hear footsteps, fast, heavy, and relentless. Someone was following us. The forest seemed endless, every direction blending into a maze of black shadows and skeletal branches. But then, through a gap in the trees, I spotted the faint glow of the rest area street lamp. My lungs burned as I pushed forward, bursting out of the tree line and stumbling onto the cracked asphalt of the lot. I slammed the car door shut, locking it with trembling fingers as Murphy scrambled into the passenger seat, panting and whining. My flashlight fell to the floor, still glowing weakly. I fumbled with the keys, my breath sharp and uneven as I jammed them into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and the headlights flooded the parking lot with pale light. For a brief moment, everything was still. The forest stood silent, the tree line unmoving, as if whatever had been chasing us had melted back into the shadows. But then I saw it, a figure just at the edge of the light. They were standing perfectly still, half hidden behind a tree, their face obscured by shadow. My headlights only caught the faint outline of their silhouette and the glint of something metallic in their hand. I didn't wait to see more. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching against the gravel as I swung the vehicle around and sped back onto the highway. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached, and my eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. The rest area disappeared into the distance, swallowed by darkness. Murphy had finally calmed down, curled up in the passenger seat, but I couldn't stop shaking. Who or what had been watching us? What had happened at that campsite? And worst of all, was someone still out there, waiting in the trees for the next car to pull into that lonely lot? I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station hours later, surrounded by lights and other people. But even now, every time I drive at night, every time I pass a rest area on an empty highway, I can't help but glance toward the trees. Because sometimes, if you look closely enough, you'll see someone staring back. The snow started falling heavier about an hour after I left my parents' house. It wasn't supposed to be this bad. The weather app said light flurries, but now the road ahead was barely visible, my windshield wipers working overtime to keep up with the thick snowflakes. I was halfway through a winding stretch of empty highway when my car started sputtering. The engine coughed, the lights flickered, and then silence. Dead. I coasted to the shoulder, my hazard lights blinking weakly in the swirling snow. I called roadside assistance, but with the storm raging, they said it could take hours. I was about to settle in and wait when I saw the faint glow of headlights approaching. A tow truck. Relief washed over me as the driver pulled up beside my car. He was a stocky man in his 40s, wearing a thick coat and a stained cap pulled low over his face. "Need a ride," he said gruffly, barely meeting my eyes. I hesitated. Every true crime podcast I'd ever listened to screamed in my head, but the wind howled outside, and the temperature was plummeting. Against my better judgment, I nodded and climbed into the passenger seat. The cab of the tow truck was cramped and smelled faintly of sweat and something sharper, metallic, almost coppery. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the smell of tools or old equipment. The driver didn't say much as he started down the snow-covered road, his gloved hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The radio crackled softly with static, and the wipers scraped rhythmically across the windshield. After a few minutes, I realized something wasn't right. We had passed an exit I recognized, a turnoff that would have led to a main road. "I think you missed a turn back there," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond, just kept his eyes locked on the road ahead. My stomach knotted, and I tried again. "Sir, I think we're going the wrong way." Without looking at me, he muttered, "Storm's worse up ahead. Taking a different route." His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading off a script. That's when I noticed the stained tarp crumpled behind his seat. It was dark, heavy, and spotted with something brownish red. The sharp smell I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, mingling with the scent of gasoline. My phone buzzed weakly in my pocket. 5% battery left. I gripped it tightly, the faint glow of the screen barely illuminating my shaking hands. Outside, the snowstorm swallowed the world in white. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct in me screamed to get out, but we were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless white. My eyes flicked to the stained tarp again, and then to the faint glow of my nearly dead phone. I opened the messaging app with trembling fingers and typed out a single message to my mom. "Something's wrong. Tow truck driver. Please call police. I'm scared." But before I could hit send, the truck jolted as it turned sharply onto an unpaved side road. My phone slipped from my grip and fell somewhere near my feet. I bent down, fumbling in the darkness, but the driver's voice made me freeze. "Leave it," he said, his tone cold, sharp. I straightened slowly, my hand empty. His face was illuminated faintly by the dashboard lights. His jaw tight, his eyes forward, unblinking. Moments later, a gas station appeared through the blur of snow, its flickering neon sign casting sickly light over the pumps. He pulled in and stopped near the entrance, leaving the engine running. Bathrooms inside. "You need anything, go now," he said flatly. I hesitated, gripping the door handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. My throat felt dry as I nodded and stepped out into the freezing air. My phone was still lost somewhere in the cab, but this might be my only chance. The freezing wind hit me like a slap as I stepped out of the cab. Snow whipped around me, sticking to my hair and clothes, but I barely felt it. The gas station's fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I pushed through the glass door, the bell jingling weakly. Inside, the cashier, a wiry man in his late 20s, was leaning on the counter, scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up as I approached, my boots squeaking on the wet tile. "Bathrooms in the back," he said, his voice flat. I swallowed hard, glancing out the window. The tow truck driver was still in the cab, his silhouette barely visible through the snow-covered windshield. I leaned closer to the cashier, keeping my voice low. "Please, I need your help. The tow truck driver, something's wrong. I think I'm in danger." The cashier's eyes flicked up, finally locking onto mine. His brows furrowed slightly, and his hand hovered over the phone. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes despite the icy cold drying my skin. "Please just call the police. Tell them I'm here." The bell above the door jingled again, and my blood turned to ice. The driver stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, before turning his gaze to the cashier. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his voice calm but with a razor edge beneath it. The cashier hesitated, his eyes flicking between us. For one long, suffocating moment, none of us moved. The snow crunched softly beneath our boots as my brother, Jake, and I set up our tent near the edge of the frozen lake. The world felt impossibly still, smothered under a blanket of white. It was New Year's Eve, and we decided to escape the noise and chaos of the city to camp somewhere remote. Just us, the wilderness, and a bottle of whiskey to toast the new year. The lake stretched out like a glassy mirror, reflecting the faint glow of our campfire. It was just past midnight when we heard it, the faint sound of a voice carried by the cold wind. "Help! Please, someone!" Jake and I froze, our mugs of whiskey halfway to our mouths. The voice was distant, weak, but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his brow furrowed. I nodded, my stomach twisting into a knot. "Someone's out there," he said, grabbing his flashlight and zipping up his jacket. "Stay here, keep the fire going. I'll check it out." Before I could argue, he was already walking toward the lake, the beam of his flashlight bouncing across the frozen surface. I watched Jake's flashlight bob farther and farther away until it became just a faint speck against the vast, snow-covered lake. The fire crackled beside me, its warmth doing little to ease the growing chill in my chest. The wind had picked up, carrying faint whispers through the trees, and every distant sound felt like it was clawing at my ears. Why hadn't he come back yet? I pulled out my phone, my numb fingers fumbling over the screen as I typed a quick message. "You okay out there? Hurry back, man." I stared at the screen, waiting for those little dots to pop up. Nothing. The minutes dragged on, and then finally my phone buzzed. A message from Jake, "All good. Found something. Come out here, you need to see this." My stomach tightened. Something about the wording felt off. Jake wasn't the type to text like that. I stared at the message for a moment before replying. "Where are you? I'll bring the gear." The response came almost instantly. "Just follow the footprints. Don't bring anything. Just hurry." I looked out toward the lake. The beam of his flashlight was gone, swallowed by the darkness. But I could see his footprints trailing across the snow, leading away from the campsite and onto the frozen lake. The fire crackled beside me, and for a brief second, I considered staying put. But then another message came through. If you don't come now, you'll regret it. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the message. The words felt wrong, sharp, cold, nothing like Jake. My thumb hovered over the screen as I considered typing back. But another text buzzed in before I could. Why are you waiting? Come now. I grabbed my flashlight and a hunting knife we'd packed for emergencies, stuffing it into my coat pocket. The fire crackled behind me as I stepped into the freezing dark, my boots sinking into Jake's footprints. The snow crunched beneath me with each step, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The lake stretched out ahead, a vast expanse of white and shadow, its frozen surface reflecting faint moonlight. I followed the trail for what felt like forever, my flashlight cutting through the haze of swirling snowflakes. But then I noticed something. The footprints ahead of me started to change. They became erratic, like Jake had started stumbling or maybe running. The wind carried faint sounds across the ice, but they weren't words. They were whispers, soft, distorted murmurs just out of reach. Then my phone buzzed again. I hesitated before looking. You shouldn't have followed the footprints. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead despite the freezing air. I turned off my flashlight and dropped to one knee, crouching low on the ice, trying to still my breathing. Ahead of me, in the distance, another light flickered faintly, a flashlight beam. But it wasn't moving. It was just hovering in place, like someone was standing perfectly still, waiting. The flashlight in the distance flickered, casting faint beams across the frozen lake. Whoever or whatever was holding it wasn't moving. I crouched low, my breath fogging up in front of me as I tried to make myself smaller, less visible. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, but I hesitated to check it. Every nerve in my body screamed that whatever was ahead was wrong. Finally, I glanced at the screen. Another message from Jake's phone. Come closer. Don't be scared. Couldn't breathe. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I typed back. Jake, if this is you, say something only you would know. Seconds passed, then a reply, your scar. Left knee. Fell off Dad's roof when we were kids. My stomach dropped. That was true. No one else could have known that. But the words felt off, as if someone was wearing Jake's knowledge like a costume. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I stood back up, taking a cautious step forward. Then, from somewhere nearby, far too close to be coming from the figure holding the flashlight, I heard it. A voice, weak, trembling. Help. Please. Over here. It was Jake's voice, but it wasn't coming from ahead. It was coming from under the ice. My blood turned to ice. The voice, Jake's voice, was muffled, distorted, but unmistakably coming from beneath my feet. I dropped to my knees, my flashlight skittering across the frozen surface. Pressing my ear against the ice, I could hear it more clearly now. Frantic gasps, weak pounding, and Jake's trembling voice calling my name. Ben, please, I'm here. The beam from the distant flashlight flickered again, but I didn't care anymore. My brother was under the ice. My gloved hands scraped against the surface as I searched desperately for cracks, weak spots, anything. Jake, hold on. I'm here, I shouted, my voice breaking in the silence. But then, my phone buzzed again. I fumbled it out of my pocket, my shaking hands nearly dropping it onto the ice. Another message from Jake's phone. Why are you looking down? I'm right here. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head and looked up. The flashlight beam, the one standing perfectly still in the distance, was moving now. Closer. Steady steps crunching on the snow-dusted ice. And as it approached, I saw it clearly. A figure holding Jake's flashlight, wearing Jake's coat, but the face was wrong. Pale, stretched, the mouth hanging slightly open, eyes wide and glassy. It wasn't my brother. It was something else. It stopped just a few feet away from me, its head tilting slightly as if studying me. Then, slowly, it reached out a hand. Come with me, Ben, it said in Jake's voice. Every instinct in my body screamed run, but my legs felt frozen to the ice. The thing wearing my brother's face stood perfectly still, its arm outstretched, its mouth hanging slightly open as if it was waiting for me to accept its offer. But those eyes, those wide, glassy, unblinking eyes, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't Jake. Beneath me, I could still hear the faint, panicked sound of Jake's voice calling my name from under the ice. "Ben, please, I'm here." My mind was racing. If he was below, then this thing standing in front of me was something else entirely. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't look. My focus was locked on the thing in front of me as it took one slow, deliberate step closer. I acted on pure instinct. Grabbing the flashlight, I swung it at the ice beneath me with all the strength I had. The sound was sharp, splintering, and a hairline crack shot out from the point of impact. Water started seeping through the fissures. "Jake!" I screamed, smashing the ice again. "I'm getting you out." The thing standing in front of me let out a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a hiss. I didn't dare look up. I smashed the ice one final time and it gave way. A dark, freezing hole opened up and an arm shot through the water. Jake's arm. I grabbed it, pulling with everything I had, until my brother's soaked, trembling body was halfway out of the water. His lips were blue, his eyes wide with terror. "Go," he choked out. "Go now." I didn't need to be told twice. I pulled him fully out, and together we stumbled and staggered back toward the shore, slipping on the slick ice, gasping for air. Behind us, the figure didn't follow. It just stood there, perfectly still, watching us with those glassy, empty eyes as we reached the snow-covered shore and collapsed in a heap. By the time we reached our campsite, neither of us could speak. I wrapped Jake in every blanket we had and started the fire back up, watching the lake through the flickering flames. The distant figure was gone, vanished into the dark expanse of the frozen lake. We packed up as soon as the first light broke over the horizon. Neither of us spoke about what happened on that ice, about the messages, the voice, or that thing wearing Jake's face. But as we drove away, leaving the lake behind, my phone buzzed one last time. A message from Jake's number. "See you again soon, Ben."